Hi, my name is Angela. At the end of every month, I like to reflect on the books that I've read for the previous month and really have a look at the kind of reading season it was and even some highlights from my month if it's warranted. So let's talk about February, which did turn out to be full of unexpected turns in my reading life. And it wasn't because of the quantity of books that I read, but because of the types of books that I found myself reaching for. This month has been quite formative, and I think the main reason for that is because I really wanted to carry over some of the good habits that I had started in summer, some analogue habits, and I particularly wanted to bring them into my weekday evenings rather than just settling into the same old routine. So what I tend to do now on weekday evenings is I'll put my phone away at a certain point, I'll put a record on, do a puzzle. I've got a new one on the go from Angela Harding, which is very beautiful but very hard. And then I'll settle in with a book for the rest of the evening, and it's been really lovely. It sounds simple, but it's kind of made my weekdays fuller by simplifying. And instead of waiting for the weekend to feel creative or rested, I'm finding that at midpoints through my week. And I think that steadiness and deliberateness has really formed my reading for the month of February. So I read 5 books in total, and they could not be any more different from one another. I found myself gravitating towards new authors and reflective titles, books that I haven't really seen other people talk about, and there was one book that completely absorbed me in a way I did not expect. I am midway through a few books at the moment, and I'll mention those at the end of the video, but here's how my month played out. Nightingale from Lohrey, Elvery. Nightingale caught my attention a couple of months ago. It was being heavily promoted at a few independent bookstores that I'm on the mailing lists for, and it's actually an independently published book from the University of Queensland Press. And it opens in 1910, and Florence Nightingale is coming towards the end of her life. She is in her 90s. She is quite a reclusive person at this point, when a young man visits her claiming to have known her in the Crimean War some 50 years earlier. I was originally drawn to it for the premise of Florence Nightingale, and I found the prose was really beautiful, the structure was original, although at times it did read a bit like a fever dream. There are 2 perspectives initially, which is from Florence Nightingale and also from this young man who visits her. And then when a 3rd perspective entered from a woman named Jean, I found the story really gained some momentum, and it became this beautiful story around love and sacrifice. It was often disorienting and a little discombobulated, but I found while I didn't always get the point intellectually, I definitely caught the vibe of the story. I understood the emotional undercurrent, which really was a conversation around women and how they are vital and yet often overlooked. And it was an interesting connection to think back to the Women from Kristen Hanna that I read over the summer, which had a very similar theme with that as well. If you're drawn to historical fiction that is more atmospheric and inward-looking than plot-driven, then you should seek this out. And from one icon to another icon at the start of her life, I read Camera Girl, the coming-of-age story of Jacqueline Bouvier by Carl Anthony. Camera Girl is a coming-of-age story of Jacqueline Bouvier before she becomes the icon that we know. And it's set in her early 20s, I think between 1949 and 1953. So the book opens in the 1949 wedding season, and Jackie is a sophomore at college, but she is looking towards her second big European summer trip that's coming up, while a lot of her friends are ready to pick out their husbands in this season. However, Jackie only has one thing on her mind, and that is getting hold of a Leica camera for her new holiday. And I was like, same Jackie, same. I would not mind that at all. But what unfolds from this European holiday onwards is the story of a really ambitious, intellectual, curious, quite funny woman who has a really heartfelt dream of becoming a writer. Eventually, she becomes the inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald, and then towards the end of the book, she meets her husband. What I didn't know was that Jackie Kennedy was engaged before John F. Kennedy. That was something I got out of this, but it's also a beautiful piece of narrative nonfiction. It's very well written. I loved seeing Jackie before the myth came into reality. If you do enjoy intimate portraits of well-known people before they become famous, I would definitely recommend this. And what's interesting is these first 2 books are quite steady. They really reward patience for just staying with them and seeing what happens. But then the next couple of books take a completely different direction. There is one that is bold and satirical, and the other is lyrical and emotional. And that contrast is what made February feel full of unexpected turns. And that leads me to one of the most surprising reads of February for me, which was The Axeman's Carnival by Chidgey. Chidgey is a New Zealand author, and I came across this book originally in a bookstore when I was travelling in New Zealand. And I didn't pick it up then, but then I saw it on a shelf here, and you know when you feel drawn to a book. And I'm so glad I did. It's a novel that is set in the central Otago region of New Zealand on a struggling sheep farm. It is narrated by Tamu, who is a magpie that is rescued when he falls from his nest. But then he unexpectedly begins to speak. From there, the book becomes part satire and part social commentary, as Tamu becomes a media sensation, all the while observing some much darker realities unfolding on the farm and the humans around him. There's a real tonal tension in this book where there are some very serious themes happening, all alongside Tamu's very funny and naive commentary. I found myself laughing out loud at times and then instantly feeling unsettled. To be honest, I thought I knew where this book was heading for the ending, but it kind of went there, but it surprised me. It was a very warm, lovely ending that I feel was entirely deserved. If you're open to magical realism that leans into a bit of satire and moral complexity, this would definitely be worth your time. It was a highlight of my month, and I suspect this is a front runner to be in my top 10 of 2026 books, simply because of how distinctive the experience was reading it. And without planning it, 2 books that I read this month centred around animals, although they could not have been any more different from each other. Blue Dog by Louis de Bernières. This is the prequel to Red Dog by Louis de Bernières, which was, if not my top book, it was in the top books of my 2025. I found it on a secondhand bookstore shelf and thought, absolutely, I'll give that a go. And these books feel quite personal because the region they're set in is where I grew up. In this book, we're returning to Red Dog, but it is his adolescence, and the landscape and the communities are very familiar. Although the way this is written, it's less like Red Dog in the sense that every chapter was around an adventure Red Dog had. This is more around the humans and their relationships and how the dog walks alongside them. I don't think this book reached the same emotional heights that Red Dog did for me. There's something comforting about stepping back into that familiar world, and Louis de Bernières' writing is really wonderful. It's encouraged me to pick up some other books of his that are perhaps well known, like Captain Corelli's Mandolin. If you read Red Dog, which I know a number of you did, this is not essential reading, but if you come across it, I would highly recommend to read it just to continue the story in that community. And shifting from this grounded nostalgia to something much more emotional and lyrical, I read Hannah Kent's Devotion. This book was extraordinary. Hannah Kent is just remarkable, and I really did think that her other book, Burial Rites, that I read last year, was probably going to be a peak book for her as an author, but she did it again in this book. This story follows a young girl named Hannah, and it is set in Prussia in 1836 initially. Hannah is a very misunderstood girl. She is so in tune with nature, but she is quite isolated because she doesn't have any friends until she meets a new girl that comes into her village named Thea. Hannah and her family and her community are being persecuted for their beliefs as old Lutherans at this particular time, and so they end up emigrating to South Australia on a disease-riddled ship. I have to say that reading Hannah Kent's writing it's a bit like seeing Technicolor for the first time, or learning to read and understanding that there is an entirely other world that you can now access. Her writing is so lyrical, and she bends words in a way that I didn't know was possible to form sentences that I never thought I would read. I found this to be a beautiful love letter to the Australian landscape. The flora, fauna, First Nations presence is also quite beautiful. And I'm genuinely sad that I now have only one Hannah Kent book left to read. So looking ahead to March, we're heading into a seasonal shift here, and I'm finding myself being drawn into rich Australian fiction. The first of which is The Labyrinth by Amanda Lohrey, which is our March read-along. We've only just started this. If you want to join us, you are more than welcome to. I'll leave the information in the description below. But this is a book that I have on the go for March at the moment. I'm also buddy reading Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr with a friend of mine. Hopefully I'll be able to provide my wrap up at the end of March on this one. And a book that I really want to read is The Sun Walks Down by Fiona McFarlane. This is historical fiction, Australian historical fiction, and I was recommended this by my mum, who really loved it. It's been on my mind for a while and I'm finally ready to pick it up. So March feels like it's starting to be quite immersive and really aligned with this slower, more intentional season that I'm leaning into. In terms of my favourite book for the month, I think it was tough, but I think if there was a book that I would most love to press into your hands and encourage you to read, it would be the Axeman's Carnival. Not because it's flawless, but because of how unexpected it was and the experience reading it, and perhaps because it is a book that you may not have stumbled across. However, my favourite book of the month has to be Devotion. Hannah Kent's writing is on another level. It completely absorbed me, and the lyricism around the Australian landscape was just beautiful. So I would love to know, what is your favourite book of the month? Please leave a comment below. And thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you soon. Have a wonderful week of reading ahead. Bye.